Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Weaver podcast. Today's episode is really dear to my heart. I want to introduce you to Nick Wignall, which is a clinical psychologist and founder of the great newsletter The Friendly Mind. Nick has helped thousands of readers to overcome relationship challenges, anxiety challenges, and other mindset challenges. And he's doing it with clarity and kindness, and of course, a friendly mind. So, whether you're new to his work or maybe you're already a devoted fan, you'll love this conversation as much as I did. I really enjoyed Nick. He's so kind and have a really approachable insight about any relationship challenges you may find. So, as we dive into the intricacies of relationship, self-criticism, we talked a lot about anxiety and how to overcome anxiety with practical tools and steps that you can apply already today and how to foster healthier connections with both ourselves and others. But I don't want to give it too much, and I want you to discover our great conversation today. I was looking for it forward for a while, I must say, because I discovered your newsletters, Friendly Mind, and what you're saying is, I don't know, a lot of people give relationship advice, but you always have the right word with something really tangible. You can really
Hmm.
use what you're saying to apply it. So I really like it.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so first, I must ask you, why did you create? I know you from your newsletters, A Friendly Mind, right?
Hmm.
And I
Yep.
think many of the people you have on social media know you through that newsletter. But in my understanding, you're also a therapist, a psychologist, or no, yeah, clinical psychologist, if I don't make any mistake. So how did you came to create that newsletter?
Yes. So I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I worked for about 7 years as a psychotherapist doing therapy one-on-one with folks. I stopped doing that a few years ago, and I work as a consultant for organizations. But before that, the newsletter and the writing got started because almost as soon as I started doing therapy with people, I started getting kind of almost irritated or annoyed that there's so much good research and advice and understanding and practices and exercises that we know of in the clinical world that if you come into therapy, hopefully with a good therapist, you'll learn a lot of these tools and insights and skills. But it just seemed kind of silly that only people who could come into therapy were benefiting from that. And so I just thought, I've always liked to write. And I thought, why don't I just start blogging and like sharing some of the insight? I have people asking me questions all day, every day. So why don't I just start sharing some of the things that I kind of teach and try to explain in my therapy sessions? I'm already doing it there. I might as well just kind of repeat it and do it out in the public. And I had no idea if anyone would be interested, but yeah, over the years, it turns out people are fairly interested in that. And so, yeah, I keep doing it. I really enjoy it. And I think a lot of people continue to find benefit from it. So that's the origin. Is just me being kind of annoyed. It seemed like silly to me that like there are all these great ideas that are locked away in therapist offices, and so why not share them?
Yeah, and I agree with what you said. I took a 9 month class for positive psychology, applied positive
Hmm.
psychology. So it's not psychology in the sense you learn it as really clinical psychology. It's kind of hybrid between coaching and psychology. It's this thing you don't really what it is, but it does have a lot of science background with a lot of research. And through that class, I learned a lot of research that have been done about um, psychology and relationship, but also mindset, neuroscience. But if you don't apply it, it just stays at the level of research, scientific
Hmm.
research. And I agree with what you said. People need to be aware of all those tools. Um, and I saw in different articles you're writing or even the videos you're making on YouTube that you're focused a lot on relationships. Even when you're talking about anxiety, we're gonna probably talk about it a little later, but even when you're talking about personal or things like anxiety, emotional management, it always relates to relationships. So is that something, why are you specializing in relationships?
Yeah, so it's funny that I didn't specialize in my training or even in my clinical work in relationships. Um, But it turns out, surprise, all of us have important relationships in our lives. Those are often the places where the parts of our life where we're the most concerned with things being better and us trying to feel better and do better and think better and all that kind of stuff is with our spouses or partners or with our managers or coworkers or with our kids or our families. That's life happens in our relationships. Everything is
Yeah.
relational. And so all these issues I talked about, whether it's anxiety or depression or anger or procrastination or defensiveness or criticism or all that kind of stuff, where people tended to really have questions and want help was, yeah, it's good to learn about anxiety, but what do I do when I'm anxious because I have to have this big conversation with my spouse, but I'm afraid to bring it up because I don't want them to get upset and then it's turned into a big argument.
Mm.
So what I found was a lot of the topics I was interested in, people were most interested in them in the context of relationships. How do I work through anxiety? But how do I work through anxiety when I have to have a big conversation with my spouse, or when I'm trying to negotiate a raise with my boss, or when I'm trying to deal with my kid having a temper tantrum, or whatever it is?
Yeah, and that's really true. I see it as a mediator and coaching people about their relationships exclusively or specifically relationships. I see it that a lot of arguments and escalation in conflict goes find their background into a lack of emotional resilience, or they don't know how to deal with anger, they don't know how to deal with resentment, disappointment, anxiety triggers a lot also. I see it all the time. And well, now you're talking about anxiety, that gives me a great opportunity to talk about an article you actually wrote that is 7 pieces of advice that will help you be less anxious. And anxiety is a big topic for me. You also have a lot of videos on your YouTube channel about this. As I deal with anxiety from my teenager time to until my 20s. Um, so in that article, you're specifically writing, stop calling yourself an anxious person. And thank you, thank you, thank you for saying that. Because I see all the time and I hear all the time that people have more, talk more easily about their panic attack or their anxious times on social media. A lot of people talk about this. But I also see a lot of people that identify with those symptoms. So instead of saying they're going through an anxious moment or they're living an anxious specific scenario, they're going to identify and say, "Oh, I'm an anxious person. It's who I am." And I kind of feel, without really knowing why, I feel it's a problem to consider yourself and attaching to that anxiety. Can you develop why you're saying that, or why you're writing, stop calling yourself an anxious person?
Sure. So I think there's two big parts to it. The first is it's just not true. Like in mental health, we have sort of come to the realization that we don't call people, for instance, schizophrenics anymore. It used to be the case that someone who had schizophrenia, you'd call them a schizophrenic. And
Mm.
it's not really true because yes, maybe they suffer from schizophrenia, but that doesn't define who they are entirely. They are much more than their schizophrenia, than their alcoholism, than their narcissistic personality, like whatever it is. So we don't call people alcoholics or narcissists or schizophrenics, or at least I don't think we should, because that's not true. That is a part of who they are, but it's not the entirety of who they are. There's much more to them than that. So it's the same with anxiety. If you have anxiety, I'm not saying you don't struggle with a lot of anxiety. You may struggle with a tremendous amount of anxiety in all sorts of aspects of your life, but it is not true that you are an anxious person because you are also a joyful person. You are also at times a confident person, even though you might not seem like it if you struggle with a lot of anxiety. It is in you. You are an intelligent person. You're a curious person. You're a funny person. There's a million facets to your personality and yourself, who you are. But to collapse all that down and to define it by this one problematic thing, anxiety, it's just extremely untrue. So that's the first thing. It's really just not true. The second part is it's also not helpful because when you start defining yourself as an anxious person, you start to see yourself as only being consumed by anxiety. You start to see anxiety everywhere. right? And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You start noticing anxiety more. And you go, oh my God, am I anxious? Like, why am I anxious? I shouldn't be anxious right now. How come I'm anxious when I shouldn't be anxious? And then off you go. Then you're anxious about being anxious, which leads you to be way more anxious. So I don't like labeling yourself as an anxious person because it tends to promote even more anxiety. You start to see anxiety everywhere and you get more and more attached to it.
Hmm.
And in my experience, people have you will have a much higher degree of emotional health and resilience if you define yourself, your identity, according to lots of different things. But in primarily, it's better to identify with your aspirations and your values than it is with the things you struggle with. So if you have to identify with something, identify with what you want, with what matters most to you, with your goals, your values, your aspirations, your dreams, right? That tends to be much more helpful because then it creates a positive self-fulfilling prophecy. When you identify with your aspirations, you start noticing opportunities and goals and dreams all over the place, right?
Yeah.
So there's a ton of reasons why I don't think it's a good idea to identify with or define yourself by your anxiety, but that's one example of why it's really not helpful. In addition to being very untrue.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and thank you because it's really and I can see when I was listening to you, I can really relate to my own experience where it started to shift really and having to kind of control the anxiety more when I started to see it from outside and be more in the metacognition, saying, okay, it's not who I am. It's right now at this moment in my life, there is this event happening that creates some anxiety and I'm being more introspective about, okay, what does that reveal about the situation? Why does this trigger specific emotions? And being more curious rather than judgmental on, oh no, not again, I'm anxious. No, I don't want to be anxious. And then you're beating yourself up to that reaction, response to a stimulation. So. Yeah, Vaz, thank you very much for saying that. And I know that you also talk about mindfulness training in a way.
mm,
So I'm also talking about this. I understand the concept without talking about specifically mindfulness, but you're talking about anxiety in a way that you should not relieve the emotions, but rather observe without engaging. So in it's what mindfulness training is for you, in my understanding, when you did write that at some point in an article. Um, I really like this, and I would love you to explain that a little bit for us, or for people who have no
sure.
idea about mindfulness is, that think maybe mindfulness is another guy that is talking about mindfulness, but how important it is to not relieve the emotion when you remember something.
Yeah, so mindfulness is very confusing because it means 20 different things to all sorts of different people. So people define it in all sorts of different ways. Um, Technically speaking, mindfulness itself is the capacity to be aware non-judgmentally of what's going on in the present moment. So you're thinking like, huh, like I can feel my heart beating faster than it normally beats.
Mhm.
So you're just observing what's happening in the present moment. You're not thinking about the past. You're not thinking about the future. You're not thinking, oh shit, why is my heart beating so fast? I'm going to have a panic attack or I'm having a heart attack. Or you're not interpreting it or telling a story about what it means. You're just noticing or observing what's happening to yourself or the world around you or someone else in the present moment. So that's mindfulness, the concept. There's also this thing called mindfulness meditation. And there's thousands of different forms of mindfulness meditation that come out of some Eastern spiritual traditions. So, like Zen Buddhism, for instance. There are mindfulness meditations that are used for different spiritual goals, or, yeah, there's part of a larger spiritual practice. So, that's a separate thing. That's a different thing. Um, there's also, especially in pop culture these days, there's the idea of using mindfulness as a coping strategy. So when you feel anxious or angry, you go into like Zen mode or whatever. You pull out your Calm app and you do some mindfulness as a way to lower your anxiety. Right. So
Mhm.
that's mindfulness as a coping strategy. Um, I can talk about it more later, but that tends to be really unhelpful long term. My approach, Well, maybe that's a good place to start. So anytime you try to avoid or get rid of a difficult emotion, like anxiety, you say, "Oh, I'm feeling anxious. I don't want to feel anxious anymore. So I'm going to do something to make that anxiety go away. I'm going to pull out my app and use a mindfulness app, or I'm going to take a shot of alcohol, or I'm going to pull open social media and distract myself." Anytime you do something like that, you try to immediately avoid your anxiety. What you're teaching your brain is that thing is bad. It's a threat. It's dangerous. And your brain, because it sees you running away from it or attacking it, trying to get rid of it, your brain learns, oh, that thing, that's dangerous. That's a bad thing. But think about it. If you're teaching your brain that your own emotions are dangerous, what's going to happen? Well, the next time that emotion pops up, the next time you get anxious, you're going to get anxious about being anxious, which is going to make you way more anxious. This is called emotional fear learning. And it's at the heart of almost every single emotional health struggle, from anxiety to depression to anger management to all sorts of stuff. This is why coping with anxiety, pulling out a little tool and trying to get rid of your anxiety, isn't good in the long term. You get a little bit of relief in the short term, but long term, you're going to end up more anxious because if you've taught your brain that anxiety is bad, that it's a threat. So what are you supposed to do with anxiety though if you feel anxious? The key is to simply allow it to be there, to be willing to feel anxiety. This is the paradox of anxiety. The way to feel less anxious long term is to be willing to have anxiety.
Mhm.
Because when you feel anxious and you go, oh, okay, I don't like this, but it's okay, it's not bad, your brain sees you approaching or being with anxiety and it goes, oh, okay, that anxiety thing, it doesn't feel very good, but it's not dangerous because they're not running away from it or trying to get rid of it. So in the short term, this is more uncomfortable. You have to just sit with your anxiety and not do anything about it. That's hard for sure. But long term, the next time anxiety comes up, your brain's going to go, oh, yeah, that anxiety thing. It's a little uncomfortable, but it's not dangerous. And so you're going to be more relaxed when you feel anxious and you're going to feel less anxious overall. Okay, this is emotional safety learning. You teaching your brain that difficult emotions, even painful ones, they're not dangerous. And when your brain really learns that, you become so much more resilient to difficult emotions in the long run. So all of that is a very long-winded setup, but I think it's important for people to actually understand
Yeah.
why I'm going to recommend the things I'm recommending. I think a specific approach to mindfulness can be very helpful if you're using it as an exercise, not a coping strategy. And this is a really important distinction. Most people, when they're giving advice about emotional health, they're giving you all these examples of coping strategies, things you can do in the moment to feel less whatever, angry, anxious, sad, guilty, ashamed, on and on. I use mindfulness, and I call it mindfulness training, as an exercise to help you be more resilient and confident in the face of anxiety, to help you tolerate and be willing to have anxiety instead of feeling like you need to get rid of it. And so the way you do that is, and there's lots of ways to do this. This is mindfulness training is just one particular but pretty powerful way to practice this is every day, not when you're feeling anxious. Just set it, pick a set time every single day, and you're going to do a little exercise, just like you would go for a run each day or go for a walk or lift weights or whatever it is. And you close your eyes and you focus on your breath, on what it feels like to be breathing. And what's going to happen is you're going to get distracted. You're going to have a thought about that thing you forgot at the grocery store, or why is this taking so long, or how come I keep getting distracted? You're going to have distracting thoughts. And all you do is you acknowledge those thoughts. Okay, I'm distracted. That's okay. I'm going to refocus my attention back on my breath. And you're going to focus on your breath. And then 2 seconds later, you're going to get distracted again, which is fine. The goal of mindfulness training is not to relax, right? It's not to be super focused. The goal is to notice when your mind gets distracted and goes on to something you don't want it to be on, and then to gently acknowledge that and refocus back on what you want to be focused on. Now, this is important. This is a crucial skill for anxiety because this is what you need to be able to do when you're feeling anxious. Instead of feeling anxious and then immediately your brain goes, we got to do something, get away from it, distract yourself, whatever, pop a pill, something like that. You need to be able to feel your brain wanting to get rid of it or run away from it, and instead refocus back on whatever you're doing and say, no, it's okay. I can feel anxious and keep doing whatever I'm doing. So there's a lot to it, but the basic idea is that mindfulness training, it builds the muscle of emotional tolerance. Just like you would tolerate people who are different than you are, That's what tolerance means in relationships, right? You have a different religion or you have a different hair color or whatever. That's okay. We can get along and do things even though we're different. You have to build that same muscle with your emotions. And the way to do that is not through coping skills, it's through exercise. That's how you build muscle. So you don't do this when you're feeling anxious. You do it regularly on a regular basis so that when you do eventually feel anxious, you are better able to respond to your anxiety in a healthy and productive way, one that allows you to be less anxious in the long run because you've built up this capacity for emotional tolerance and resilience. Whew, that's a lot. Sorry. but
No, but there's a lot of gems in what you're saying, so I'm just drinking what you're saying. Food for the soul and the brain, so I'm good with it. I can't help but make a parallel with yoga when I was listening to you because I do yoga every day, a little bit every
mm,
day, and part of yoga is breathing techniques
mhm,
and challenging the body while keeping a steady breathing. And I realized on the long term, I've been doing that for like 6 years, almost every day. So at some point, you realize that when you practice, all is well, all is fine, but you still practice that steady breathing while being challenged on your balance posture or different positions. Then, if something happens that if definitely not related to yoga, something else, anxious moment, whatever stimulus is coming, and your heartbeat is going faster, then it's easier because it's as if your body remembers the
mm.
process to the heartbeat going fast, to the breathing techniques going steady. So it's easier to transfer that skill on a different stimulation. And I feel what you were saying is basically also this transferring, practicing when everything goes fine to transfer it when you really need it. Don't wait for the bad situation to practice. And this is key. This is key to mastering the skill, I think. Yeah,
That's a great example. I love it. Same thing.
yeah. Um, there is something that also you and basically it's when I thought, oh, I need to talk to him and to have a real good conversation. You were talking about self-criticism in one of your
Mhm.
newsletter and leading to an article, and you were saying that it's partly rooted in genetics. Now, I'm not an expert in neuroscience, I'm not an expert in genetics, but I'm very fascinated about epigenetics, that and the philosophy around epigenetics, where you scientists start to show that you can reshape a certain behavior or certain neuronal path by taking care of the environment and taking care of redefining your thoughts. So in your article, you were not talking about epigenetics, but is that something that you also believe in, or what is your position about that? Do you think people can change their behavior, or are they doomed with the card they receive at birth?
Oh, absolutely. But I would make a distinction here. Epigenetics is for sure a real thing, but um, I want to distinguish between epigenetics and learning. So
Okay.
epigenetics is something in your environment changes how your genes are expressed. So you have a gene, and it's got genes aren't just on or off; they're like a volume lever, right? And so your genes influence your behavior, right? But your environment can turn up or down the degree to which a particular gene or set of genes are expressed, right? Now, so that definitely happens. So that's important to understand. But when it comes to our behavior and doing things differently, our behavior is partly influenced by our genetics, which then is influenced by our environment via epigenetics. But our behavior is also influenced by learning. So I'm not an expert in epigenetics personally, but I am a relative expert in learning, in kind of behavioral psychology and how we can change our behavior, including our mental behavior, to go back to self-criticism, by learning,
Yeah.
especially through habit formation. So I think there are like just about everything in life, every behavior in life has a pretty strong genetic basis. And by genetic, I'm speaking broadly. It could be actual genetics, but it could just be that we inherit personality factors from our parents, right? We inherit basic temperamental things. Even our really early life experiences, right, affect how we grow up and go out through the world, right? So there's this whole class of things that are they're kind of innate, they're in us. Doesn't mean they can't be modified a little bit, but it's important to acknowledge that if you're the kind of person who always has struggled with self-criticism, for example, I definitely think you can get a lot better at being less self-critical. But are you just never going to be self-critical, or will you be like the least self-critical person in the world? Probably not, honestly. Like, just if you're the kind of person who is kind of wired that way, is predisposed that way, there's a lot you can do to improve, but it would be naive to assume that genetics or your personality or your early learning experiences don't matter at all. So I want to caveat that, like, those things do matter, but you can absolutely get much better at not being so self-critical. And you do that through learning, through thinking of self-criticism as a behavior, right? So something happens, you make a mistake, and then you catch yourself going, damn it, I knew, I can't believe I screwed that up again. And you go, wait a second. So there's the first part, awareness,
Yeah.
right? You can get much better at catching yourself doing this thing called self-criticism. So that's the first step, is just being aware of your self-criticism. And in particular, I think identifying which types of situations and environments make you more predisposed to self-criticism. Because chances are, even though it doesn't necessarily feel like it, there are probably certain situations, like maybe it's difficult conversations with your spouse or meetings at work or whatever. There's probably certain situations where you're more likely to be self-critical. Knowing that is important because then you can anticipate it. But even if you're more aware of your self-criticism and you can kind of anticipate where it's going to be more likely, the next step then is to remind yourself that you have agency, you have control. Self-criticism is a behavior. It's something you are doing. Now, it's a habit often, so it often doesn't, it feels automatic, but so does tying your shoes, right? That is something you are doing, even if it feels automatic, right?
Mm.
And because it's something you're doing, you have control over it. You can change that behavior. It's not easy all the time, but you have to acknowledge and really remind yourself, this is something I can control. Because people who struggle with this, one of the biggest struggles is they think self-criticism is something that happens to them. It's like their brain playing a trick on them or something. And when you think that way, it leads to this kind of helplessness, like, oh, I guess I'm just a self-critical person. Like, what can I do? If you think it's something that happens to you, you're going to feel helpless and you're not going to be able to make the kind of changes you need to make. On the other hand, if your mindset is, this is something I'm doing, it's a habit, but ultimately it's something I can control with practice and patience and commitment, you can absolutely change it. You can get better. You can feel yourself starting to criticize, and then you can go, you know what? I'm actually not going to do that. I know that's not going to be very helpful for me right now. Instead, I'm going to refocus on, what did I learn from that mistake or failure? And like, what could I do differently next time? Just as an example.
Yeah, and
So I feel like if I lost I lost your original question there, but
no,
hopefully that
I'm
sets
keeping
up the
track, and
self-criticism question.
no, no, I'm keeping track, but I'm smiling because I know you in some videos and articles you're talking about high achiever and high performance, and people who are very perfectionist usually also are very highly critical toward themselves. I personally feel concerned. So it's very interesting to hear that, and I can imagine also some clients, for example, also high achiever most likely also for jobs, but there is also client that come and wants to make their marriage work no matter what because they
Mm,
have kids or maybe someone cheated, but just once, and you need to make it work, or different things can happen on a relationship level where one person takes the pressure to make it work and are more critical toward themselves if it doesn't. Um, what can we advise to those people who are having this tendency to criticize themselves more than necessary
mhm.
or take the load of the mistake or of the failure?
So I just said that one of the keys to working through self-criticism is to kind of really take full responsibility for it. Like, this is, however hard, this is something I'm doing, right? So that kind of ownership or agency is really key. The next step, though, is to realize that, well, okay, I get that I'm doing this up to myself. I keep criticizing myself. I know it's not good for me. I just feel like garbage afterwards. It's not helping me do anything. The next step, though, is to employ something that's called functional analysis. And functional analysis is this fancy sounding psychology term, but it's really straightforward. What it means is that anytime you have a bad habit, whether it's biting your nails or criticizing yourself after mistakes or whatever, if a habit sticks around, it sticks around for a reason. On some level, you are getting something out of it. It's doing a job. This behavior or this habit, it's doing something for you, right? So if you want to get rid of this habit, you have to understand, what job is it doing? What need inside me is it addressing? Because if you want to get rid of that habit, you have to find a better, healthier way to address that need. And once you do, you will put the bad habit, like self criticism, out of a job because you're getting that need met in another way. So, for instance, a lot of people in my experience, especially this kind of perfectionistic high achiever type, when they get anxious, they get really critical with themselves because self criticism is a form of control. You're think by like kind of analyzing the problem, you're trying to take control of the scenario and think like, oh, if I'd only done something differently, then it would have been better. And this leads to the illusion of control. It makes you feel like, oh yeah, I could have done something differently, or if I just think hard enough about this, or like analyze it to death, I'll figure out some solution. What's happening here is people who do this, they feel anxious, and because they don't know how to deal with anxiety, they immediately go into their head. They start analyzing and thinking and kind of over processing cognitively. And for a lot of people, self criticism is the form that takes. So, this is an example of how the need that needs to be met is you need to figure out how to deal with your anxiety in a way that's less problematic. A lot of people use self criticism to deal with anxiety because it temporarily gives them the feeling of control and like being in charge,
Yeah.
which alleviates or distracts from the anxiety. And my experience is that if you don't want to do so much self criticism, figure out a better way to address that anxiety. Like we talked about building tolerance to anxiety. I think ultimately that's a really helpful way to think through anxiety. But if you want to stop, and that's not the only function of self-criticism. Some people, for instance, think self-criticism, they because of the way they grew up or the way they kind of learned to go through school and work, they've, for a variety of reasons, learned that I need to be self-critical on myself in order to succeed. That's the lesson they've internalized, is that when I'm struggling with anything, a project at work or in my marriage or whatnot, because in the past, I've always been really hard on myself and then I've ended up succeeding. So they assume that the self-criticism is an important ingredient in the success, right? So they
Yeah.
think I need to be hard on myself in order to motivate myself to succeed. But in reality, literally every single time in my experience, people who are successful, they're successful despite their self-criticism, not because of it. So if you think you need self-criticism to motivate yourself to succeed and achieve and perform, what you need to show yourself is you don't need that as motivation, right? There are other forms of motivation. You cannot be critical on yourself and still perform at least as well. And probably, like wink, wink, you will probably perform better if you're not criticizing yourself. But that belief is never going to change unless you can actually show yourself. You can't just tell yourself in your head. You have to prove it to yourself, right? So these are both examples of functional analysis. If you have this bad habit, self-criticism, you have to understand, what need is it filling? Is it helping me deal with my anxiety? Is it helping me feel motivated? Like whatever it is. To get rid of self-criticism, try to get that need met in a healthier way. And then you'll find you don't need the self-criticism nearly as much.
Yeah, this is I heard that you were also talking about this in another video on your YouTube channel, and I remember listening to this and getting that question, what purpose does this anxiety serve at this exact
Mhm.
moment in my life? And within few seconds I had the whole protocol about, here is anxiety. This is serving this purpose. This is finding the roots in fear of rejection, why there's fear of rejection, and XYZ, all the things. I can't even tell you exactly what it was because I was so fast. But for people listening to me and to you, I've been doing that introspective work for a while. So maybe for other people, it doesn't take that fast. It needs a little bit longer. However, very quickly, within few seconds, I was able by just your question, what purpose has this anxiety or this behavior, self-criticism or, high expectation or whatever behavior,
Mhm.
by just this question, I was able to get one action that would lead me towards something more constructive. And that doesn't mean you have to, and I think that's also the misunderstanding when people try to solve their or try to manage their anxiety or their emotions, is they're thinking a goal that is way beyond their ability at exact time in their life. Doesn't mean it's not possible, but the gap is way too big between where they are and where they want to go. So I guess in your work you also have incremental um, incremental steps toward a big goal, but you're not gonna say to someone that comes to you with panic attack, okay, the goal is to not be anxious anymore. It's probably not what you're telling them, right? So can you say how you, if now someone has, comes to you and say, where do I start? Because anxiety is destroying my marriage. Anxiety is just destroying myself. I'm not thinking clear because I'm so anxious. It's impacting the discussions I have with my partner and getting me into a self-fulfilling prophecy, a story I tell myself that is not necessarily true. So
Mhm.
where do they start specifically?
I would start by getting very clear on what the problem actually is. And what I would, even though it feels like it, anxiety is never the problem. It's how you respond to anxiety that's the problem. So let me give you an example of this. If anxiety is not ruining your marriage or your relationship, it's your response to anxiety that is problematic. So, for instance, a lot of people, when they get anxious in a relationship, they get defensive. They start criticizing, right?
Mhm.
That's what's problematic in your relationship, not the anxiety. Or a lot of people, when they get anxious, they start reassurance seeking. They get this kind of overly clingy reassurance seeking. Are you sure? Are you okay? Are you okay? They're always checking in. They're very preoccupied. That's what causes problems in the relationship, not your anxiety. Your anxiety is not disrupting the relationship. It's the fact that, understandably, probably for a lot of reasons, nobody gets taught this stuff in school. You don't have an especially healthy relationship with your anxiety. You don't understand where it's coming from. You don't understand what it's trying to tell you. Your capacity to just be with it, to tolerate it, and to accept it is not very strong, right? That's a muscle. And if you haven't practiced that, it's not going to be very strong, right? So the problems in relationships are a function of behavior, not emotions. It's our behavior, it's the choices we make and the things we do that impact our relationships for better or for worse. So it's a subtle distinction, but it's very important. You have to distinguish between the emotion and the behavior. If for no other reason, then you can't directly control your emotions. There's no knob on your head that you can twist to turn your anxiety down. There's no lever you can pull to like make yourself happier. You don't have direct control over your emotions. The only thing you can control directly is your behavior, what you do, what you say, or how you choose to think. So if you are going to improve in your relationship, first of all, you got to keep your focus squarely on your behavior. And this includes, by the way, this is not about your partner's behavior. Because again, not something you can control. That may be problematic, right? But you have zero control over your partner's behavior. If you want to improve a relationship, the only the only option on your control panel is your behavior. So it's not your emotions, it's not their behavior, it's not their emotions, it's your behavior, how you choose to think, speak, and behave. Okay, so I think and I know that sounds a little harsh, but so many people get so mixed up and confused and overwhelmed because they're trying to control things they can't actually control, including their own emotions, like anxiety. You can't control anxiety. All you can control is how you respond to your anxiety. Now, that being said, back to your real original question of, so someone hears that and they're like, oh, okay, I guess that makes sense. But still, what do I do? I get really anxious in my relationships. And then I start doing stuff that is problematic. So like, how do I get better? You alluded to this idea of what I call incrementalism, which again, big fancy sounding word, but it's really straightforward. In any area of life, if we want to develop a skill or get better at something, we don't just skip from point A to point Z. You slowly practice and work your way up. So, for instance, my daughters are learning how to play the piano right now. If you've never played the piano, you don't sit down and try and play Mozart. It's just not going to happen, right? It's a dumb idea. It's as much as you want to be able to play Mozart, like you are not good enough, either competent or confident enough to play Mozart, right? So what do? You learn Twinkle Twinkle Little Star or Jingle Bells or Hot Cross Buns or some basic song that's pretty easy, and you get good at that. And then once you get good at that, you move up to the next song that's a little bit easier, and you spend 5 years getting better. And now you can play Mozart. Now you can play Rachmaninoff. Now you can play Beethoven, right? So we know this in every aspect of life. You have to slowly and surely and patiently get better at things. If you really struggle with anxiety in your relationship, what I would suggest is look for areas of your life that are smaller amounts of anxiety that are opportunities to practice responding to anxiety well. So if you really struggle with anxiety in your primary relationship, your romantic relationship, you probably from time to time get at least a little bit anxious at work too. But maybe the anxiety is a little bit lower because you're more confident at work and it's whatever, the stakes are lower. I'm just as an example. Use those as an opportunity to practice these skills we've talked about. So, for instance, tolerating your anxiety instead of trying to get rid of it with a coping skill. So you're in a meeting and you want to bring something up, but you're feeling a little bit anxious because it's a new idea and you think people will think it's stupid, but you decide to do it anyway. You think, you know what? I'm feeling anxious. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with feeling anxious. I'm going to speak up anyway, despite the fact that I'm feeling anxious. There, you're building that skill of tolerance in a setting that's easier for you. It's not easy, but you're more confident doing it at work, right? Or maybe it's with your parents or with, a best friend or something. So find practice opportunities to build up both your competence, your skill, and your confidence, right? The belief in your ability to do it.
Yeah.
Then try applying it. Or, another way to think about it too is it doesn't have to be exclusively outside of your relationship. You can look for situations in your relationship where you get anxious, but you don't get as anxious. Maybe there's a certain topic. Maybe when you bring up sex, like that produces a lot of anxiety for you or for your partner or whatever. So that's just like a big, scary, intimidating one. Well, don't start there. Start with like your kid's school or something. That's maybe it produces a little bit of anxiety, but not as much. So you want to look for practice opportunities, smaller, lower stakes situations that produce a little bit of anxiety. And instead of just brushing them away, right, think of them as opportunities to practice acknowledging how you're feeling, right? Okay. Oh, this is anxiety, right? I'm feeling nervous. I'm getting a little panicky. Validating or accepting it, which means this doesn't feel good, but it's okay. It's not bad that I'm feeling anxious, right? And then refocusing on whatever it is you need to be doing, having the conversation, getting on with your work, like whatever it is. So practicing those skills in smaller, lower stakes situations will build up your skill and confidence so that you can more easily apply them when the stakes are higher and it's more intense.
Yeah, in what you said, what I hear is in the end a lot of acceptance toward yourself, and also one of the pillar from positive psychology, which is self-compassion.
Mm-hmm.
That is self-compassion for you, but also having compassion and acceptance for your partner, and to acknowledge their own journey. I know it's something that is a work for every day, and it's also something that helped myself personally in my own relationship, that I'm more compassionate toward myself where I am at and where my partner is. Um, I feel very often, and I'm curious to have your insight about that. Very often, when someone is anxious in a certain relationship context, they're being, despite not necessarily consciously, but they're putting themselves into a victimization mode and entering that drama triangle that is always, victim versus saver, and waiting because they're feeling vulnerable in their anxiety, waiting for their
Mm-hmm.
partner to save them and to show them solution, or, to take the pain, the anxious pain out of them. So, do you also feel this with your clients or generally?
Sure. I mean, I think it's very understandable. Like if you don't feel very skilled or confident dealing with a difficult emotion like anxiety, for instance, but it's also true of shame or anger or sadness or all sorts of difficult emotions. But it makes a ton of sense that if you don't feel confident or competent dealing with a difficult emotion, you might outsource that to someone else. You might hope that someone else takes care of it, especially if you have a history of other people taking care of your emotions. If I do X, if I get really sad, right, then people around me come and comfort me and support me and whatever, right? So you learn, and I'm not saying people do this deliberately, but they learn over time, right,
Yeah.
that they can do things that will result in other people giving them support to kind of help them through their difficult emotions. And I say that like, I don't know, we all have stuff like that. It, it is what it is, right? It's there. What's important though is realizing that that's probably not the most optimal way to deal with emotions, is to outsource them or to get other people to manage them for you. Ultimately, they are your responsibility. Whatever triggered them, right? They are yours. They are no one else's. And you are the only one ultimately who is responsible and who can sort of react and respond to those well. So I think that combining both kind of this radical self-compassion, it's okay that I get really anxious,
Yeah.
right? It's not dangerous. It's not bad. It doesn't mean anything about me as a person. It's just this thing. Everyone's got their struggle. Everyone's got their thing. My thing is I get super anxious, right? It's okay to feel anxious. And I am taking radical responsibility for how I respond. It's no one else's job but my own to
Yeah.
deal with that anxiety in a healthy way. So that's the powerful combination. You see people, a lot of times you see people they're all about compassion, but they're just kind of like then sort of fuzzy and vague about like behavior and responsibility. Or people who are like kind of hardcore and really like drill sergeant-y about behavior, but they're not very compassionate at all. Neither of those work. The optimal, the best, what only works in the long run is when you combine both of those mindsets together of intense, radical compassion for other people and for yourself, and radical responsibility for what you actually being willing to take control of the things you have control over, your behavior and how you respond to emotions, and not trying to control things you can't control, other people's emotions, other people's behaviors,
Mm.
which sometimes is just as hard, if not more hard, right?
Yeah.
Um, so I think from like a mindset perspective, I think that you really have to spend some time trying to get clear on these things, right?
Yeah, and there is something that also I see with my husband is in the end also acknowledging and being radically honest with yourself when it's a good time to listen to what your brain says and when it's not a good time anymore. So, and you can see a pattern when you're aware of this and you're really listening to your own responses for quite a time. Then you see if it's every day after 9 o'clock in the evening, you start to have some thoughts that leads to some arguments, and you're like, okay, after 9 o'clock, we're not having that conversation. If that's not useless, if that's not useful, we're talk about this another time. And honestly, there is quite sometimes when myself, I'm like, the best thing I can do so far today is just go to bed. I'm not, it's nothing works. I'm not good anymore. I'm going to bed. And that's it. That's, curtains and see you tomorrow. And the morning,
Totally.
fine, the
That's
morning,
one
I'm
of the
fine.
it's
It's,
one of the pieces of advice about relationships that I hate the most. I think it's the most untrue and unhelpful. This thing that never go to bed angry. Have you ever heard someone say
no, no,
that?
go to bed.
Oh, it's this really common piece of advice, like never go to bed. And it's well intentioned. It's like if you're having conflict, like work it out or whatever. So I get the intention behind there, but it's actually subtly a very destructive mindset because behind that is the assumption that to feel angry is bad.
Yeah.
I can't feel, if I feel angry, I have to do something to get rid of my anxiety. How many people, if you're, and I've done this a bajillion times. If you're listening to this, I'm sure you feel this, or you can think of times when you've done this yourself. You feel super anxious or super uh, mad, angry, right? Or really sad or scared or whatever it is. And you immediately, impulsively try to do something to make it go away, including trying to have a conversation about something when
Mm.
you know it's a terrible time to have a conversation. It's 11:30 p.m. and your partner has had a super long day and they're exhausted and the kids were a nightmare all day and like this is not the best time to address that. You want to address it now because you don't want to feel anxious anymore. But that doesn't mean it's a good time to do it. In the long run, you would be much better off being willing to be anxious for another 12 hours and then address it at a time where you can be much more productive and hopefully have a much better result. But again, it goes back to this idea of so many of the behaviors that are destructive to our relationship with ourselves, but also to our relationship with other people. They come from emotional intolerance. We feel something and we impulsively want to do something so we don't have to feel that way anymore, including something that sounds like a good thing. Oh, we're going to sit down and have a big conversation about something.
And
There's nothing wrong with big conversations. You need them sometimes, but you have to be smart about it. You can't do it just because you don't want to feel some way anymore.
yeah.
So that's my that's my
Yeah,
rant
no,
about never
that's
go to bed
very
angry.
true. That's very true, and I experienced that. And I had the question also once where someone was asking me why is my husband always, responding in a defensive way? And the first thing I questioned was, how did you say what you said? So what you said, but how did you say it? How was your
Mm,
body language? What tone of voice did you use? And when she came to me, she was, the arms very forward, an attitude that was subtle but quite aggressively in a way. And I told her, look, your arms are like this, and your shoulder this way, and everything on you is showing I'm gonna get you.
mm,
So if it's perceived, then your husband or your spouse or your wife, your partner, whoever is going to be responding on a matching level. And I experience this every single time when I come to say to my husband, why did you say like what, like a victim? What did I do? But then I question, what energy did I put in before he
mm.
answered? And every single time I was having an energy that was demanding that reaction every single time. But it's also true vice versa. So that's also something very interesting to observe.
Yeah, and it's a great example of this attitude of responsibility. Like, what is it? I can't control whether my husband gets defensive or not. I can control, though, the attitude with which I go into a difficult conversation. I can choose, I can be careful of my body language. I can notice my tone of voice. I can choose to do it at an optimal time instead of at a terrible time. These are all things that are under my control. There's so many things that aren't under our control. It's a shame to ignore the things that actually are under our control. So I love your example about kind of body language and energy going into those conversations.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a lot of very interesting things. I'll need to listen to that myself as well. Um, One thing before we end that I wanted to quickly talk about is one of the thing you're talking in your newsletter and articles again, it's forgiveness. And
Mm,
you made the distinction between forgiveness and reconciliation by specifically precising that don't make reconciliation a prerequisite for forgiveness. And the reason why I love these words is because in mediation, a lot of time people are stuck and don't find an agreement because they're holding on resentment, anger, and
mm,
any emotion that is blocking the way toward reconciliation because they believe if they sign an agreement or if they agree, even a dispute in the personal life, if they, compromise with their spouse or partner, that means they're okay with what happened, or
mm,
they have to make like nothing happened, and it's all good. When it's not necessarily all good, and it doesn't mean that because you forgive that you're gonna be best friend again. So what led to that article, and can you give some context around that?
Yeah, I just want to say real quickly, I love what, so first of all, that idea is not, it's not my, I didn't originate that. A lot of people have made that claim that forgiveness is not the same thing as reconciliation, right? So it's not that that's not possible, and maybe you do want that, but to assume that those two things are the same is a big mistake. But I also like what you said, which is slightly different but related. Don't confuse forgiveness for endorsement. Like, just because you forgive someone doesn't mean you're endorsing their behavior and saying, oh, actually, that was okay that you did that, right? You can still very much acknowledge and believe that what they did was very wrong and hurtful and bad or whatever, and choose to forgive them. Right. So that's another, I didn't talk about that in my article, but I think that's a nice point too, is that those are separate things, endorsement and forgiveness. And forgiveness doesn't mean you're endorsing or okay with what happened. That article, the biggest thing was I saw a lot of confusion in my work as a therapist, as a coach, and even just people writing into my newsletter. There seems to be a big confusion around forgiveness, which is that a lot of people, when they talk about forgiveness, it sounds like me reading between the lines. What they really want is to feel better about a situation. Someone
Yeah.
has done something wrong to them. And what they really want is they don't want to feel bad about that. They don't want to feel resentful. They don't want to feel angry about that anymore. They don't want to feel anxious about it anymore. But forgiveness is not a feeling or the absence of a feeling. Forgiveness is a behavior, it's a choice.
Yeah.
It's you choosing to say, I'm letting this issue go. I am not going to give it any more of my brain space. I understand that there were, that they did this and there's probably all sorts of factors. You can add a little compassion to it. Like what they did was awful, but given the way they were raised or the situation they were in, or like, there's some whatever. So you can add that if you want. But the bigger point of forgiveness is you were deciding when this issue comes up again, when I see that person at the holiday party, or when I get an email from so-and-so, the person who hurt me, I don't, I have control over my attention and my thoughts. I don't have to spend the next 15 minutes ruminating on that terrible thing they did to me. That's a choice.
Yeah.
And forgiveness means I am choosing not to do that and instead to get on with my life. So I think it's very important to define forgiveness as a behavior, a choice, really a commitment rather than a feeling or an emotion. So I think that's my suggestion. I'm not the grand poobah of forgiveness, so I'm not saying this is the way you have to do it, but I think it's you at least want to think about and clarify when I say I want to forgive someone, what does that actually mean? Like, what do I really want? And in my experience, I think what's most helpful if you want to truly be free of the anger, the resentment, the being stuck in the past, basically what you have to do is you have to take responsibility for your own attention and say, I'm not going to let myself continually get sucked back into that awful thing that happened. And this is why my last point in that article is that ultimately forgiveness is about your future, not the past. It's about making the choice to not allow your attention to get sucked back in the past and instead to focus on what you actually want, to let that go and then to refocus on what you really want. So that's kind of how I think about forgiveness. And that's the approach that I've seen to be pretty helpful to a lot of people. So that's why I wanted to share that one.
And do you think that we can forgive only if we have compassion for the other person, or if we are able to be in their own shoes to understand the context, their story, how they behaved the way they did that led to that behavior?
I don't, so this is another distinction I would make here is that forgiveness is a tricky topic because it's so associated with kind of religious or spiritual terms. Like forgiveness in the context of a religion might be something pretty different than forgiveness in the context of like psychology. They're
Mhm.
related and there's probably a lot of overlap, but that's a whole other thing. And so I think some people's conceptualization of forgiveness might mean that you do have to do the compassion part. For me, psychologically anyway, I think that can be helpful, but I don't think it's necessary.
I was
I
asking,
think, yeah,
yeah, go ahead, sorry.
I think forgiveness is primarily about you taking control over your attention and deciding not to continue to ruminate or dwell on some injury to you that happened
Yeah.
unhelpfully, and instead to put your attention onto something productive and helpful.
That's interesting because what you just said is actually what personally led me to not hold on any grudge toward anything, toward someone. So it's really that ability to understand, oh, okay, I don't have the full picture yet. So if I had the big picture of how that person was raised, what the parents were doing, or, the context, also the personality or the different
Mhm.
life events before me, I can also understand. okay, that probably led a succession of decision or event that led to that behavior. But yeah, I think also time just at some point is just also a big key to let go of something, to just allow the time and, live different adventures and have different things to do in life. Yeah.
I think that's key. And one thing I've observed in my own work is that the people who are most successful at forgiving, they're the people who have the most things in life that they're excited about. So the people who look forward in life and they're like, oh my gosh, I got all these like things I'm interested in and excited about and goals and dreams and aspirations and ambitions. It's easier to let go of the negative stuff in the past if you've got a lot to look forward to and move toward in the future. But if you look forward into your future and it's just kind of blank or there's like nothing there that's particularly exciting or motivating or that you feel passionate about, well, of course you're going to be more drawn back to the past because there's like nothing in front of you.
Yeah.
So that now if you're hearing that and you kind of feel yourself in that situation, I think the challenge there is to start to build, to cultivate things in your future that you're looking forward to.
Yeah.
This isn't just something
Project.
that happens or not happens. We are responsible for our futures
Yeah.
and for what's in them, right? And for what's out there that's exciting or interesting or so I think indirectly that might be the best way to truly like forgive and move on from something is to just live your life instead of like living in someone else's like in the
Yeah.
past and what happened to you before.
Yeah, that's in the end the importance of having life project and goals to live for yourself and not giving too much power to other people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
or ironically, to live for other people instead of just dwelling on your own stuff, right? There are probably people in your life who could really benefit from you and your attention and all your talents and skills and right who you could really be serving and helping and
Yes, sir.
mentoring and whatever it is. But if you're just stuck, if you spend a ton of time and energy dwelling on your own memories from the past, it's not very helpful, but it's also just gonna it's not going to be very it's not a very fun way to go through life, right? So cultivating this kind of forward-looking approach to life, it's one thing to say it, it's harder to actually do it. But if you're not clear on what you want to do there, it's not going to happen.
That's a great key to keep in mind for the end of the episode. Um, but there is so much to have, and I had so much more questions.
That
But
always happens to me when I do interviews. Is I have like 40 questions I didn't get to, so that's good.
yeah, that's a lot of things really very insightful and I think very helpful. Before we end, I have like, few personal questions that I like to ask. The
Sure.
one would be, what is one of the biggest mindset shift you've experienced?
um Great question. Biggest mindset shifts that I've experienced. I think when I was in school, I studied. I was an English major. I studied literature, and then I was a teacher for a little while afterwards before I got into psychology. But when I got into psychology, I went to grad school, and I had to do because clinical psychology, you need to do a lot of research. So I had to start doing research and I started working in a research lab. And even though in high school I had learned about like the scientific method and hypotheses and observing and testing your hypotheses and gathering data, all that kind of stuff, like most things in high school, you're like, yeah, whatever. But then when I started doing it, I really internalized the idea of and the importance of having an experimental attitude toward really everything in life, which is you want to look at things and see them as an experiment. So you have an idea for how you want to do things. Don't hold it too tightly. Think, okay, this is an experiment. I'll try it out. I'll see what are the results? What do the data show? And then based on that, I'll use that as feedback and I'll try something a little bit different and try to kind of refine my process. So you can think about this with anything. You can think about this with your work or with creative projects or with how you approach difficult conversations with your spouse. But instead of this kind of like a lot of times we have a kind of a good, bad, moralistic mindset to a lot of things. And I
Mm.
think, and I would put myself in that. But this, when I sort of went through grad school, I think I learned this more scientific experimental mindset that I found could be applied to all sorts of aspects of my life to really great effect in terms of my relationships and myself really is to treat life like kind of like an experiment. where you're constantly tinkering and getting feedback and tweaking and trying again. And I just think it's a really, for me personally, it's been a really wonderful way to navigate, especially kind of challenging circumstances. So sorry,
Yeah,
that's a
I
long
love
answer, but
this. I love this. Yeah, getting more, being more curious, trying out, seeing it more as a
totally.
playful thing.
That's a great word for it too. Being playful about it. Yep.
Um, the other one is there any mistake that you consider as a failure, like yeah, something that you consider as a failure, but I don't like really use the word failure now anymore, that you actually realized afterward that was maybe something you grew through that event.
Oh, let's see, a failure. It's so interesting. I've really tried over the years to
There
think
is no
less in
such
terms of
thing as a
failures and
failure.
successes and more as like experiments that go well or not so well. Yeah, let me see. I mean, I can think of, I mean, I feel like relationships, right? A lot of my first kind of romantic relationships, you just like you screw up so much. Like, God, I made a lot of mistakes. Like I'm like learning being, I remember being in a relationship in my mid 20s when I was going to grad school and like learning about all this cool stuff in psychology about like cognitive distortions and self-talk. And then I found myself kind of like playing therapist with my then girlfriend. And she called me out on that. She was like, no, 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 no. Like, you are not doing that. I am not your patient. You are not a doctor. Like, we are not doing that. And I remember being like, oh, wow. Yeah, that's terrible. I definitely need to be more careful of that and mindful of that. So I feel like, relationships, there's a lot of weight on them and they're very, there's just a lot of pressure in a lot of ways, like because we care so much about them, but they are such rich sources of feedback and growth if you're willing to look at them kind of from that mindset. So that one of like not playing therapist with my then girlfriend, that's one where that was definitely a big kind of fail or mistake. But luckily, like she was super straightforward about it and called me out on it in a very direct way, which was very helpful to me. And I think I still fall into it sometimes. I'm sure my wife would tell you, but I think I'm a lot better at it than I used to be. So that would be, I guess that's my that's a good one.
Good example. Um, okay, and the last one is actually, is there any for all those who listen to us right now, any piece of advice you would have among all the advice you have, or
Mm.
incredible advice on your newsletter and all your materials, um, anything right now that you would even, for example, say to your daughter, if there is one thing to remember?
So I think the concept of assertiveness and assertive communication is incredibly underrated in psychology, mental health, just relationships generally. And the basic idea that I wish more people understood is that when you are communicating, it is possible to communicate with both maximal honesty and maximal respect. So often people think like, oh, like I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, so I'll kind of like I won't say everything I want to actually say, or I'll tone it down a little bit, and you'll be kind of passive, right? Or some people are just aggressive. They don't give a shit about how other people feel or what they think, and they just like steamroll people, right? So that's they're high on being honest to themselves, but they're very low on respect. Assertiveness is this combination of being learning that you can be in the way you communicate and interact with people, you can be fully honest and authentic to your own wants and needs and fully respectful of other people and their rights. And when you learn to start doing that, everything gets better in your relationship. Every single type of relationship gets dramatically better. Now, it's not easy, like we talked about. This is a skill that most people have not learned, but you absolutely can learn this skill of assertive communication. You have to start small. You practice in really low stakes situations. It's, you go out to a restaurant for a date night and the hostess seats you at a crappy table by the kitchen. And instead of just going, well, I guess, I don't want to say anything that would be awkward or uncomfortable, you actually call the hostess over and say, actually, if you don't mind, we would love to sit over there at that table, even though it's kind of uncomfortable. And you are being assertive, right? You're asking for what you really want in a way that's still very helpful or very respectful. So I think assertive communication, like knowing that it is possible to do that and having that as a goal and an aspiration and like a skill that you are actively working on and cultivating. So many things get better and easier, even with small improvements in that skill of assertive communication. So I think that's my number one piece of advice for people who, especially in the context of relationships, practicing communicating more assertively.
Well, you're saying this to a mediator. I'm not gonna say no, but of course I can absolutely agree with that. Yeah, so that wraps up our conversation, and thank you again, really. That was well, a lot of things and a lot of insights. Yeah, that was great. Thank you very much. I really appreciate. And if you have people interested to follow what you're doing or joining you along the journey, where do you want them to go? Maybe your newsletter or somewhere else. I know
Yeah,
some courses online.
sure. Well, thank you for having me on, Sonia. It's been a pleasure, a really great conversation. Yeah, if people want to go and learn more about me and my work, the best place is definitely just my newsletter. I send a free weekly newsletter every Monday morning, and the website is thefriendlymind.com. And you can sign up, and it's basically an advice column for emotional health. I just answer reader questions. I do videos and articles and all sorts of things, answering questions and all sorts of topics. Relationships is a big one, but anxiety and stress and anger and grief and all sorts of stuff. So yeah, that would be the place to go.
I'll put all the link in the description so people can find it very easily.
Awesome.
Well, thank you very much for having accepted. I'm thrilled. I'm really thrilled, and we have so much more to discuss still, but well, we'll keep it short for today. Thank you, and then I will talk to you another time, I
All
guess.
right. Sounds good, Sonia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, take care then, and have a good day.
All right. You too, Sonia.
Bye bye.
Bye.